Hi everyone, and welcome to TLDR Week 5 for Linux Administration. This week, we are going to be working on networking, looking at the different types of network configs and starting to learn how to monitor network settings and start using some basic networking commands. With Linux, networking is either completely straightforward and everything works immediately, or you're probably looking at several hours of troubleshooting. One of the first things that I would like you to do is go into your CentOS virtual machine, and I would like you to install networking tools. I'd also like you to install networking tools in your second server to make sure that you have the networking tools installed in both servers. Feel free to pause me here so that you can go do that. One of the things that can make networking and Linux very confusing is the amount of variability by distribution. What ends up happening in Linux is in some cases you actually have to edit the config file to get your network settings working. Some actually rewrite the config by script every boot. So if you edit the config file and then restart, all of your work will be lost. Some actually go through a specialized app, and that's how all of your networking changes need to happen. And it's important that you know which one of these three options your machine or machines are going to follow to make sure that you're able to work with the networking configurations or scripts or apps in the correct way. First things you should pay attention to. You want to look at your IP addresses, static versus dynamic. My example is an admin. If you are an admin, you are likely to want to set yourself a static IP address that will always have access. So if you have to do something like lock down a server because it's being attacked, you will still be able to have access to your server. Then you're going to want to start paying attention to your DNS. Which one are you using? Does this make sense? Was it the default? Should you switch to another one? Then you're going to want to know about the name for each of your networking interfaces and figure out if your server is using IPv4 or IPv6. My first example is networking and Red Hat. In Red Hat 7, it's actually something called a network manager as the default service. The networking scripts in Red Hat actually live in the etc init.d network folder. They can be run manually. You can also run on boot if you need to. The first thing you do is start your network manager. The networking scripts will check the network manager's connections, and then the networking scripts will run the scripts as a secondary. There are manual processes that you can do where you can actually use the commands if up or if down. Those are scripts that have been written that you can use if you need to interact with the networking settings a little bit more specifically. There are also some custom commands that you can use, if up local, if down pre-local. You can create those. There's a warning to go with this. If you modify any of the files in the init scripts package or related RPMs, Red Hat will no longer provide service. Now I'm using Red Hat as an example because CentOS is the free version of Red Hat, so they are going to function sort of similarly. If we look at networking and Debian, it actually is going to be using a config file which lives in the interfaces folder. Resolve.conf is for the name servers. ResolveConf is a program which is not the same thing as resolve.conf. ResolveConf is the program that works on the resolve.conf file. ResolveConf is optional. There is also a GUI that you can use, but the automatic network config tools are for desktop users only, not servers, and you should have the server version that you're using for this class. The next activity that I'd like you to do is not the CentOS server, whatever your second server is. Pull up the documentation, and I want you to look at how the network is configured. Is it a config file? Is there a script? Is there a tool? What do you see? Where did you find it? How did you find it? and make a note of all of those things. This should be somewhere in your notes and your documentation, but you want to do a little bit of research to see where that is. Feel free to take a moment and pause me here and come back after you've done this. The next thing that we want to look at is some legacy issues. Now, there's a very common command that you're going to see that a lot of people will use called ifconfig. Now, this command is actually technically legacy. It is used to configure and display the network interfaces. It's actually widely used, and there's a lot of people that only use this. People that have been doing Linux for a while, sysadmin work for a while, probably started using this, and because it worked, they were unwilling to change, which very understandable. When you find something that works, it's hard to move past it. They've come up with a new command called IP. It's a new way to do what ifconfig does. If you look at the link that I have included on this screen from TechMig, they actually did a very nice breakdown of ifconfig versus IP and comparing what you can do with the two, along with some examples. It is worth going through this and trying each one to make sure that you are comfortable with it. I have a list of important commands that you need to know. You should make sure that you are able to either run each of these commands, or if you can't run this command, figure out why you can't run it, what went wrong, and how you could get that information in another way. The next activity that I'm going to have you do is I want you to try each of these commands that I have up on the screen now. And what you want to do with each of these commands is try and see what happens, what was expected, and if the expected thing didn't happen, why? How could you fix it? And if it doesn't work at all, what could you do instead? A surprisingly large amount of time with Linux and sysadmin work is actually spent troubleshooting, because even if somebody else has had the exact same problem, it doesn't necessarily mean that their solution will work for you. The activity or lab for this week is actually going to be documenting your network setup. You're going to continue updating your documentation with any programs that you've installed, the dates that you've done those things, and you're also going to write a small script. This script is going to be a network info dump. This can be, I have a couple of minimums: IP, DNS, show open ports, but you should also think about what other things do you think might be useful. Make sure that you always have the date and the purpose in this script so that whenever it's run, it's automatically going to add the date in. The script needs to be well commented, and you need to make sure that you are including instructions for how the script would be run if it is getting passed to someone else. If you have any questions, please let me know.